Our speaker is Paul Bloom, the Brooks and Suzanne Reagan Professor of Psychology at Yale, and he will be discussing his recently published book entitled Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion, and it has been causing quite a stir.
I started to argue against empathy about 3 years ago in an article I published in the New Yorker, and it's the first thing I ever published on this. And so I was very eager to see what people would think about it. And so immediately, once it was posted online, I immediately went on social media to get a sense of the response. And the very first thing I saw, the very first thing was a tweet on Twitter. It had a URL to my article, and it said, "Probably the dumbest thing I have ever read ever." And since then, I've received similar responses and critiques. One blogger at Harvard described me as a moral monster and an intellectual disgrace. So I've come to realize that my message is not entirely welcome. And to some extent, being against empathy sounds a lot like being against kittens. It's not really a sort of view one could seriously hold. I think part of the problem here, not the whole problem, but part of the problem, is that people mean different things by empathy. So some people use the term as a catch-all term for everything good, for compassion, love, morality, wanting to make the world a better place, and so on. And I'm certainly not against it in that sense. In fact, it's because I'm for all of those things that I'm against empathy. Others use it in a narrower sense to describe what people think and the understanding of what people think and feel, sometimes known as cognitive empathy. And I'm not against that either, though I think it's not a force for good or a force for bad. It's amoral. Cognitive empathy is a form of intelligence, sometimes called social intelligence, and like any sort of intelligence, it could be used for good or for evil. It's true that somebody who wants to make the world a better place would benefit hugely from knowing how people's minds work, but also you find the same trait in successful con men, seducers, psychopaths, and torturers. The sense of empathy that I'm concerned about is the capacity to put yourself in the shoes of other people and feel what they feel. And this is actually the same as what the scholars of the 18th century described as sympathy. So Adam Smith, as usual, provides the best description. He says that when we feel this, we place ourselves in someone's situation and become in some measure the same person with him, and thence form some idea of his sensations, and even feel something, though weaker in degree, is not altogether unlike them. And psychologists have long been interested in this. So there's a rich body of neuroscience literature, for instance, that find that what they do in these experiments is the subject experiences some sort of pain. They're pricked, they're shocked, they got the thing hot put on them, they're blasted with loud sounds. And we monitor their brain activity when this happens, and then they want someone else be pricked or burnt or blasted or shocked. And it turns out the very same parts of the brain light up in correspondence to this, suggesting that the phrase, "I feel your pain," is in some sense literally true. We do have that mirroring. And other psychologists have found that when you feel empathy for somebody, when you're asked to put yourself in their shoes, you really are kinder to them. You direct your focus towards them, and you tend to care more about their welfare. Accordingly, a lot of psychologists, philosophers, neuroscientists see empathy as critically important for morality. Martin Hoffman at NYU argues that it's the developmental core from which all of morality comes from. Franz de Waal argues that it's the evolutionary core of morality, not just for humans, but you find it in non-human primates as well. His book on the topic is called Age of Empathy. Simon Baron-Cohen, the Cambridge psychologist, is one of the strongest proponents of the importance of empathy, where he argues that evil is nothing more and nothing less than empathy erosion. And of course, lay people and politicians and theologians jump in as well. Barack Obama has spoken more about empathy than any president of our time. And at one point he says, look, the biggest deficit we suffer in our country and in the world has nothing to do with money, it's an empathy deficit. So how could somebody be against this? Well, first thing to realize is no matter what kind of empathy fan you are, you've got to acknowledge it's not essential to moral judgment. There's all sorts of things we appreciate are wrong, even if we can't find anybody to empathize with, any identifiable victims. So throwing trash out of your car window, or cheating on your taxes, or contributing to climate change. You can't point to somebody and say, well, that person's going to suffer, but still you might view these as morally wrong. Then there's cases where empathy can clash with other moral values. A wonderful example is by the empathy scholar Dan Batson. He tells a story of this girl, this 8-year-old girl named Sherry Summers. Sherry Summers is going to die. There's nothing you can do about that. But there's a treatment you can give her that will alleviate her suffering, alleviate her pain. The problem is she's low on the line for treatment. She'll die before she can get it because other kids have been waiting longer and are even more desperate need. So you ask people, would you move her up the line? You're a hospital administrator, you just move her to the top of the line, knowing that if you do so, some other kid is going to go off the line. And most people say no. They say it's too bad, but if it's a fair list, we should leave things as they are. But another group of people get exactly the same story, but they're told something. They're asked, put yourself in her shoes, feel her pain. And now all of a sudden responses shift, and people want to move her up. And Batson points out that this is a case where empathy leads us astray. It overrides other moral motivations that we should be keeping in mind. My critique is stronger. I think empathy really is like a spotlight. It zooms you in on people, and when it zooms you in on people, you're more likely to help them. I agree with that. But like a spotlight, we could point it in the wrong places. So it's subject to bias and myopia. And like a spotlight, it's insensitive to numbers. So it's innumerate and ultimately irrational. And one way to make this case, to kind of start off, is to think about the real world cases that have captured the imaginations of Americans, our interest, our focus, our concern. So some of us are old enough to remember all these girls that got stuck in wells. Girls would often get stuck in wells, and then the whole community would get together and it'd be on the front page of Time magazine as we try to get them out of the well. Some of us will remember Natalie Holloway, an attractive white girl who goes on vacation, I think in Aruba, and gets abducted and murdered. And most recently, and most affecting me, given where I live, there was the mass murder in Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. Now, I don't want to make light of any of these incidents. They're all extremely important, involving real death and real pain and suffering. But I'm not the first to notice that there's something strange in the focus we give to them. The psychologist Paul Slovic noticed that when Natalie Holloway went missing, there was 18 times more network coverage devoted to her than in the ongoing crisis in Darfur, which took the lives of tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. Mass shootings like Sandy Hook are undeniably tragedies. But we tend to think of mass shootings as a huge problem. It turns out that mass shootings account for about 0.1% of US homicides. And what this means is if you could snap your fingers and make it so that there'd never be a mass shooting in America again, nobody would ever notice because it'd be indistinguishable from statistical noise. But it doesn't feel that way. And we see it in a lab as well. There are numerous experiments showing that you care more about one person than 8 people if your attention is drawn to the person as an individual. The same neuroscience studies that show empathic resonance in the brain show that empathy is extremely biased. Somebody like me is going to feel more empathy for the suffering of a white person than a black person, than a man, than a woman. All of us feel more empathy for people who are attractive than people who are ugly. And for those people who disgust us, we feel no empathy at all. Now I want to deal with the sort of objections. So an immediate objection is, fine, empathy can be innumerate, it could be biased, it's imperfect, but it's better than nothing. It doesn't do any harm. But it can do harm, and it's not hard to think of examples. I'll start with a hypothetical example. Suppose there's a vaccine program in New York, and a little girl gets extremely sick and dies. Most likely the vaccine program will be shut down. It will be shut down even if it were to turn out that this program was actually saving the lives of many kids, because you could feel tremendous empathy for the family of a girl who suffers, for the girl herself, but you can't feel empathy for the statistical fact that people would have died but didn't. Or take a real world case of this. Some of you may have heard the name Willie Horton. When Mike Dukakis was governor of Massachusetts, he had a furlough program. And in the course of the furlough program, a man named Willie Horton, an African-American man, was released. And he went on to assault somebody and rape somebody else. This program was seen as an embarrassing failure, and it was immediately shut down. And Dukakis apologized for it, and this came up in the election against George Bush, which Dukakis lost, and it was seen as a humiliating failure. Now, it turns out that analyses, even at the time, suggested that the furlough program was working. That is, because of the program, there were fewer assaults, fewer murders, fewer rapes. But our emotions are insensitive to that sort of data. It is easy to feel tremendous empathy for someone who is assaulted or raped, but you can't feel empathy for some statistical abstraction of people who would have been raped, but weren't. And then we think about issues like foreign aid, which I know many people here are engaged with. And as people know, there's a lot of controversy over the extent to which foreign aid is actually helping and the extent to which it's hurting, and a lot of criticisms about the way empathic appeals are used to direct funding. And there's all sorts of examples about this. One example raised by Linda Pullman concerns warlords in Sierra Leone, where when asked, why do you chop off the limbs of children? Basically answered, we do it for you. They pointed out that they get a lot of support from NGOs and government agencies who come to their country. They take taxes from these people, but nobody comes unless they give them an atrocity. And so our empathy for the children is cynically exploited by evil actors in the world, and there are many cases in which this happens. Empathy can be a catalyst for violence, and this was again pointed out by Adam Smith, who notes that when you think about atrocities, we often think in terms of hatred and dehumanization. It's all true. But one engine for atrocity is the empathy we feel for victims. And this is true all through, this is not ancient history, through the invasions of Iraq, the more recent bombing of Syria. Whenever politicians in a democratic society want to incite anger and hatred against a group and want to motivate a group to war, they tell stories about victims. Sometimes true, sometimes not true. And our feelings for the victims, and I remember, for instance, the horrific stories of Saddam Hussein's monster sons and the atrocities they committed, energize us. And our empathy for them energizes us to want to strike out. And we see this in the very current political climate, which is a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric isn't just sort of broad statistical claims. It's not hatred per se directed against immigrants. Rather, and you see this, for instance, in the work of Ann Coulter, whose book Adios America was the motivation for Donald Trump's policies, they tell stories about the suffering of people. Her book is all about rape. It's about rape and child rape. And it makes you feel tremendously bad for the victims and then tremendously angry towards the people who caused their suffering, in her view, Mexicans and Muslims and other immigrants. So empathy could be weaponized, and it often is. The second objection is somebody could say, well, maybe you're right about public policy issues. But isn't empathy critical for certain relationships? And maybe particularly relationships between doctors and patients, nurses, therapists, and so on? And I think, again, it depends what you mean by empathy. So a lot of places, including Yale Medical School, where I work at Yale, have what's called empathy training. And I have nothing against empathy training, because when you look at it, empathy training is basically to get doctors to listen to their patients, to treat them with respect and everything. But empathy, in the sense I'm concerned about, real empathy, is nothing but a minus. For doctors to really feel the suffering of their patients leads to burnout. The best medical professionals understand their patients, care about their patients, but they don't feel their pain. And it's not good for the patient either. If you could forgive me an anecdote, my uncle was ill last year with cancer, and we were in Boston. I went with him to see different doctors. And the sort of doctors he got along well with, he liked, were ones not who felt his anxiety, not who mirrored his anxiety and his worry and stress, but were respectful and confident and clear and honest. Somebody who didn't echo his suffering, but rather responded to it. And certainly this is the case for therapists. So therapists have to understand their clients, and they have to feel compassion for them. They have to know what they're going through. But anybody who thinks therapists should actually feel their client's pain doesn't understand therapy. In that, if I go to my shrink and I say, and I'm really, really anxious, This book will never sell. And, and I don't want her to get anxious. I don't want her to go, oh my God, we're in big trouble. Then I have two problems, not one. What I want her is to kind of look at me and say, so how does that make you feel? And, and basically have the sort of distance that's part of any good therapist's training. You don't want to mirror people. You want to respond to them with love, compassion, and caring. A third concern about an anti-empathy stance is that people without empathy are monsters. They're psychopaths. And it's true that psychopaths, if you do a psychopath test, you could all do it online. One of the features is low empathy. But it's also true that of all the features of psychopathy, low empathy has zero predictive power when it comes to predicting bad behavior towards people. What really matters in predicting whether a psychopath is going to reoffend is issues like aggression and lack of self-control. The same is true for you. So there's now been dozens, maybe hundreds of studies looking at the connection between low empathy, because some of you are very low empathy, and aggression. Sexual aggression, verbal aggression, physical aggression. And the punchline is there's no connection at all. Again, if I wanted to figure out which one of you is likely to jump me on the way out of here and take my wallet and my notes, giving you all an empathy test will tell me nothing. The test I would give you, I'd ask you two questions actually to figure out which one of you is likely to harm me. The first one is kind of obvious. Have you ever harmed anybody in the past? Have you ever committed a crime? Have you ever committed a violent crime? Have you ever beaten up a speaker leaving the Carnegie Council? And then the second question is, how's your self-control? Because basically a lot of the certainly violent crime isn't due to a lack of empathy, it's due to an inability to control our impulses and our appetites. The final objection is that, okay, empathy may have all of its problems, it may cause harm in the world, but without empathy, we'd be terrible people. You need some sort of kick in the pants to get you to do good in this world. And I agree with that totally. The point is as old as the philosopher David Hume, who pointed out it's not enough to rationally figure out the right thing to do. You also have to have some sort of motivation, some emotional push to get you to do it. But what I want to suggest is there's alternatives to empathy. Our moral psychologies are very rich. We have all sorts of moral motivations. There's guilt, there's shame, there's concerns about our reputation, there's an honest desire for it to be a better world. And I'm most interested in the distinction between empathy and compassion. And I don't want to get too caught up in the words. People use the words in different ways. Forget about these are just the way I'm calling them. You could call them something else. But the distinction is very important. And I actually got connected to this distinction when I was at a conference in London, and I'm at the registration booth at the hotel, and I see this guy, this monk in saffron robes, and he's Matthew Ricard, who's a very famous meditator. He's so-called the happiest man alive. That's what it says in Time magazine, which means if you put him and me together in a room, you'd average out one normal man. And so I go up to him in my normal, smooth way. I say, "You're Matthew Ricard, the happiest man alive." And because he's a monk, he was very polite to me, and we go for tea. And he asked me what I'm up to. And I tell him the truth. I say, "Oh, I'm writing a book against empathy." And I feel very awkward doing this. Like I'm telling a rabbi, I'm writing a book against Shabbos. You know, it was like, I thought but his response surprised me. His response says, "Oh, empathy's terrible. Of course you should be against empathy. Too obvious to write about." And it turned out that, and I hadn't known about this, but he had been engaged in this very famous research program with the neuroscientist Tanya Singer. And it was just starting, and it's been developing like crazy over the last few years, which carefully distinguishes empathy, which is feeling other people's pain, being motivated by the experience that they're suffering, from compassion or loving kindness, where you care for people, but you don't feel their pain, you don't suffer. And so they do an experiment after experiment after experiment. They find when you're in an empathic state, it activates different parts of your brain than when you're in a compassionate state. But more to the point, they find that compassion invigorates you. It leads to more helping. Empathy exhausts. Compassion charges you up. It makes people better helpers, more efficient helpers, kinder helpers. And more recently, there's been work by David DeSteno and his colleagues at Northwestern University on mindfulness meditation. And there's all sorts of claims about mindfulness meditation, its health benefits, and so on. And I think we should be cautious about them. But they have a finding which has been replicated several times, which is that it makes you nicer. It makes you kinder to strangers. And nobody knows why. But the theory that they advance is that mindfulness meditation makes you kinder because it shuts down the empathic centers of your brain. If I'm in a mindfulness state and you're suffering, I don't feel your pain as much, which liberates me to be kind and loving to you without the aversive feelings. So sometimes people get the idea I'm against empathy. Nothing could be further from the truth. I'm a big fan of empathy. Empathy is a wonderful source of pleasure. It is the empathy with people who are having a great time could be terrific. I think it is an essential part of sports, an essential part of sex. I think one of the joys in having children is being able to take an experience you've had 100 times before, like fireworks or Hot Fudge Sundae or a Hitchcock movie, and experience them all over again for the first time through the eyes of another person. I think empathy is at the core of the pleasure of fiction, of TV programs, of plays, of movies, where an empathic connection with characters, even bad characters like the Tony Sopranos and Walter Whites of the world, give us this immense pleasure. My problem with empathy is as a moral guide. Now, I hate terminological arguments. I don't care what you call it. But my argument is that feeling the suffering of other people, experiencing their pain, many people view this as the core of morality. I think this is mistaken. I think it makes us worse people. That empathy is morally corrosive, and we're better off without it. So I want to encourage all of you to join me in a crusade against empathy. Thank you.
I couldn't help, while you're listening to your talk, think that maybe that explains what happened on November 8, because so many of the, quote, liberal elites have enormous amounts of rational compassion, but it was Donald Trump who empathized with all those people in the Rust Belt who lost their jobs.
Yeah, you're raising a lot of issues. By law, in any discussion of longer than 40 minutes, Donald Trump's name has to be mentioned. Donald Trump and empathy are not words that naturally go together, but I think you are right. I think Donald Trump was, forget about how much empathy the man himself has as a character trait. This is a separate question. He is very good at stoking people's empathy for political gain. I mentioned talk about the crimes committed by immigrants, but also basically he gets you to, if you listen to one of his rallies, he will get you to feel strongly for people who have been lost and abandoned by American elites, people in the Rust Belt, for instance. He's done well at that. And then he does seem to do a very good job of exactly what you're saying, of conveying empathy for people, for the people in his audience. They feel, and you hear this in interviews, they feel like he really knows them. And it's sort of strange because of course, his life situation is as different from them as you could imagine. But more than Hillary Clinton, I think he's seen by his supporters as empathic. And my argument here was about empathy as a moral tool. When it comes for you and I doing the right thing in our lives, should we rely on empathy? And I argued no. But if it was a talk on how to be a successful politician, the answer would be different. And empathy is a tool like stoking up anger and resentment. That's a powerful tool. I agree with you.
I've been interested and concerned in the decline in childhood immunization. And I wonder, to what extent is this just the inability of people to process scientific information, or to what extent does misplaced empathy for people with autistic children contribute to that?
It's a great case because I think there are many things going on here, including, among other things, a sort of social signaling where vaccination has turned out to be almost a sort of political shibboleth for who you're supporting for president, what your social views are. But I also think empathy plays a role, and I think my hypothetical example speaks to that, which is a child who is harmed through vaccination is an extremely salient event, and there's an enormous amount to empathize with. This child who came into the doctor's office fine and now is severely autistic. It's a horror story that you could resonate with. While the benefits of vaccination are in some way empathically invisible. They're terrible things that didn't happen. And we don't process them to the same extent. You know, Benjamin Franklin actually wrote about this with regard to vaccination, where he talked about psychologically about how would it feel if you gave your child a vaccine and your child was to grow to be incredibly sick. How would you feel? Compared to not giving a vaccine and your child becomes sick, it's not quite the same. You didn't make your child sick. And so there's different things going on here, but I think your case is a perfect example of how our emotions lead us awry, as well as how cynical politicians and demagogues exploit them to lead us awry.
Thank you. That was great.
Thank you so much for having me.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.